Hey guys, Will here. So welcome back to our review series on the IMMSOURCE ET5, ET3 wheelbases and FD1 steering wheel. Yesterday we took a detailed look at the hardware, so check that video out if you haven't already. Today we're going to be looking at the software side of things, seeing how everything works there, and also of course doing our driving tests too. And we'll come back again tomorrow with our conclusions on these products and whether they're the right products for you. So let's get started. Okay, so let's dive into the IMM-Platform software. So simple download package is a zip file that you download from the IMMSOURCE website. When you unzip the package, you get a folder that looks like this. You've got an executable file there, as well as a bunch of folders there for different configurations, firmware updates, and so forth. So you double click on the executable file and it will bring up the IMM-Platform software as we see here. So a nice clean layout, I've got to say. Quite impressed with how this looks at face value. And you can see up here, it's got the model of the wheelbase which we've got plugged in, which is the ET5 at the moment. ET3 is going to operate in exactly the same way. So we're not going to go through all the same settings for both different wheelbases, but we will of course do driving tests with both, just to let you know how they both perform. And then we also have the firmware version listed here as 0.14. Now there is a firmware update available for this, I believe. So we'll check that out, show you how that process works too. Now over on the left-hand side here, quite similar to a lot of other software packages that we've seen lately, we've got access to our base settings, our wheel settings if we have an IMMSOURCE wheel connected, and also a game tab which will inject the appropriate settings into the configuration file for most popular games. And you can see a list of the games that are supported down the right-hand side here. So everything from more simcade games like Forza, for example, all the way through to the more hardcore sims like iRacing. So pretty decent selection of games here straight out of the box. And you can see for a first time setup here, it's as simple as just clicking on the game and importing the settings. It does auto detect the game that you're playing and apply the appropriate preset as well, which you'll see in just a minute. But let's move back to the base tab for now. Actually, let's click on menu here. You have the option to select from a couple of different languages. Now, this version did default to English for me. I've heard of a few people having it default to Chinese and having a few problems. If you do have an issue with that, all you need to do is click on this little guy here and just change your language. You've got the option here of simplified Chinese, traditional, or English. We're going to go with English. You have the option to auto start the software with Windows if you want to, minimize to tray automatically too, so you can just have it load in the background should you wish to do so. You can also adjust the elements of the UI here too, so we can go small, medium, or large. We can also adjust the font size here too. And we can also check for updates right here in the software as well, which is nice. Means that you don't have to go on a website to manually check if there's any updates available. So I'm going to hit on that right now and see what we have. No, software already the latest version, so that's good. And we also have the contact to go through to the website, which you can click on directly there too. So let's close out of settings again. Now, the next thing I want to do here is do a firmware update on the base, because I want to show you how that works as well. So we're going to click on MISC here. And then we can see online update or local update. So if you have a firmware package that you want to load manually here, say a beta release or some sort of custom firmware potentially as well, then you can flash that via the local update, and that just brings up a standard Windows dialog box. You can point it to the appropriate file within your firmware folder. Now, one thing that I will mention also is there is a hard reset button on the back here, which you can use to force the base into bootloader mode. So the fact that we have a separate partition here for our boot sector and our system software, much like on a smartphone, for example, means that even if you do have a bad flash on the base firmware, as long as your boot sector is still good, then you will still be able to recover the flash. You're not going to brick your device. So that is a good way of handling firmware updates, makes it a lot safer than flashing the entire thing, including the boot sector, all in one go. If you corrupt the bootloader, then you have a hard brick device and chances are you're going to have to send it back to get reflashed. So that's all good. So let's go back to our main system tab now. And we can see here, this is a basic overview of the core functionality of the wheel. So you can see our steering angle here, we can center that. So if we put the wheel dead center there and hit center, we should get a reading of 0 there. Nice and simple. We've got an adjustment here for our sensitivity range, so we can set that to automatic. We have a bunch of presets here from 180 degrees all the way through to 1080 degrees. And if we wind that all the way up manually, it does go all the way up to 1600 degrees as well. So if you're doing truck sims or something like that, you can wind that rotation physically all the way up to something nice and high to give you a lot of steering angle. Now, with a direct drive wheelbase, there is no mechanical bump stop built into the base itself. It can spin infinitely. So what they do is they implement a software-based bump stop there, and there is an adjustment for that as well. So when we hit the bump stop, it does have a nice stiff feeling there. One of the things that we have seen on some wheelbases is when you hit that bump stop, you get into a sort of a feedback loop almost, where it's wanting it to go back, and then you hit it again and it goes back and it goes back and it goes back, and it kind of starts bouncing on you. This actually has a really, really nice feel to it. I'd say that is on par with my SIMUCUBE 2 Ultimate wheelbase, which impresses me. And if we go into our force feedback settings here, there is actually an adjustment here for endpoint strength, which was actually set to 10 by default. So let's wind that down. And yeah, okay, that feels a lot softer. So good that you have an adjustment range there. You can tune that in to feel however you want. Maybe if you're drifting or something like that, you might want to have it a little bit softer or maybe a little bit harder. It's going to be a personal preference thing, but it's good that you have that adjustment there. Let's wind that back to 10 for now, and we'll come back and we'll have a look at the rest of these settings in just a minute. Otherwise, here we can see our buttons showing up down here as well. So as we push various different buttons on the steering wheel, they show up as button presses on there. Now you may notice that 51 and 64 are highlighted there currently. That is because we have our 2 rotary switches on the base of our wheel set to multi-position switch mode rather than rotary encoder mode, but we'll explain that in more detail in just a minute too. Then up the top here on the right-hand side, we can see our various different axes for our analog paddles here. So left paddle, right paddle, our analog hat switch for view moves around as well. And then we also have provision here for throttle, brake, clutch, and handbrake. Now on the bottom right here, you'll see the 6 USB ports, which we looked at in our part 1 video yesterday on the back of the device. Now it's important to understand this isn't just a generic USB hub, so you can't just plug in any device. The manual kind of insinuates that that's the case. It is only compatible with a selection of various different third-party peripherals. At the moment, it's compatible with things like the FANATEC Club Sport V3 pedals, TLCM THRUSTMASTER pedals, for example, and a few other more obscure bits and pieces that are less common, but they do tell me they're upgrading that list quite regularly. So what I recommend is check their website or check with your local distributor to find out exactly what's compatible. Now up in the top right hand side, you may also see this little button that says normal mode. If we click that, it disconnects the base and then reconnects again in what is known as comp mode. Now this is kind of similar to what we have with the FANATEC CSL DD and GT DD Pro, for example, where you can switch between different modes depending on the game that you're playing. They tell me that comp mode is necessary for the Forza games at the moment, whereas everything else should work in normal mode. So all of our testing today is going to be done in normal mode, but it's great that they do give you that option for wider compatibility. So let's move on to our tuning tab now, or the FFB tab. And let's have a look at what we've got going on here. So next to force feedback here, we do have a tooltip menu, which takes us through explanations for all of the sliders that we have on the right-hand side here for tuning our force feedback. But before we get to that, just a couple of other quick things here. So on the left-hand side here, we have a real-time current torque graph, which is quite cool. We'll show you if you've got any clipping going on in terms of what the motor is actually outputting. So I can only assume that this is the torque which is being commanded of the motor rather than an actual torque gauge, you know, measuring the input on the motor itself. Now, the reason I say that is because if I turn the wheel around to the bump stop and kind of force it into the bump stop range, you can see there at the maximum bump stop setting, it's sort of capping itself at about 12 Newton meters. If I wind that value down, you can see now it's going to cap itself at about 10 Newton meters. So even if I force harder than that, it's only ever really going up to that same level. So to me, at least, it seems to be a commanded value rather than a measurement on the shaft of the motor itself. But either way, it's a useful tool for tuning and seeing whether you've got any clipping going on. Now, clipping would look basically like this. If we go to the maximum, you're going to see a straight line at the limit there. So when we're bumping over curbs and things, you would see a flat line rather than a nice sine wave like that as we're going over bumps and things. But anyway, we'll explore that later on when we go for a drive. And down the bottom here, we've also got an automatic preset assignment tool. Now there is a tooltip here which explains exactly what it's doing, but just to give you the quick rundown, essentially what this is doing is detecting the game that you have open and then automatically loading the linked preset to that game. So say for example, you have one particular preset that you always want to use with Assetto Corsa. What you would do is link it, and then every time you open up Assetto Corsa, it's going to use that profile. So obviously then you would want to choose between different presets, but for somebody who just has a basic preset that they use to get each game feeling, you know, generally good, then this is a great way of doing it. You can have this minimized in the background. It means you don't have to go in there and change presets every time you load a different game for most general usage anyway. So that's a cool little feature. So if you are commonly using different profiles of different types of cars within a single sim, then you may want to switch this off, and you can do so with the little toggle switch there. So again, a useful feature. They're thinking outside the box there, and that is a cool thing to see. We do also have the ability to, of course, import, load, and save profiles, delete profiles as well if you want to get rid of some old clutter, and also rename existing profiles too. And those are all stored in the IMMSOURCE folder under presets. So you can of course share presets among your friends or teammates if you wish to do so. So we'll close that off again. And let's take a more detailed look now at our fine-tuning adjustments for the force feedback. So we've got another steering angle adjustment here, pretty much doing exactly the same thing as we saw before. You can switch between auto or manual adjustment here with a slider. Remembering again, of course, that on our main tab under System, we had our presets there too, if you want to switch between them quickly. Now, if we go back to the force feedback tab again, we have our maximum torque adjustment here. Now, if we go into the tooltip, the way they explain it is limit the maximum amount of torque of the base. The recommended value is between 8 and 12 Newton meters. Now, I assume 8 and 12 is maybe for the ET3 because obviously this base goes up to 17 Newton meters, and it doesn't make much sense to set our maximum value lower than the maximum available torque of the wheelbase, because then what's the point of having a more powerful wheelbase? Now, the reason I'm drawing attention to this is the wording here. So limit the maximum torque of the base. Now, there's a very important distinction here between a limiter and a gain control. So what this is actually doing is adjusting the overall gain rather than setting a hard limit. The difference there in the real world being that if you adjust the gain, what you're doing is just scaling up or scaling down, or basically turning up the volume or turning down the volume on the overall force feedback. So all the effects underneath that limit are also going to be shrunk down as well, or scaled up or amplified as you go high in the scale. Whereas a limiter, all that's doing is just setting a maximum limit to the maximum amount of force feedback that you're ever going to feel. So what that would mean, for example, is that the details that you feel in road textures, ripple strips, things like that, which are underneath that limit, are always going to feel the same. But then if you have a crash or something like that, you're not going to have the wheel just absolutely torn out of your hands. So we did a little bit of testing here. I'm just going to show you quickly now how I've kind of derived that conclusion. So if we hit drive here quickly and just go back so I can see my graph here. So as I drive along on the grass, you can see with our force feedback torque set to 10, that is the size of the ripple that we got going on. If we crank that down, you can see the ripple shrinks, even though we're nowhere near that maximum limit. We're not anywhere near 1.4 Newton meters of torque right now. If we wind that up to 17, you can see the torque is now amplified, even though it's nowhere near that 17 Newton meter limit. So effectively what this is a gain control or volume control for the force feedback. It's turning up or scaling up and down the maximum amount of force feedback available and adjusting everything else underneath that range as well. So I would like to see a overall strength adjustment as well as a maximum torque adjustment. This maximum torque adjustment is essentially an overall strength adjustment. So I'm going to wind that maximum torque value back up to 17. So we're taking full advantage of everything that the base has to give. We're going to start off our driving test later on with default settings here, and then we'll do some fine tuning adjustment. I'll let you guys know where I land in terms of these settings. But for right now, I just want to go through and explain to you exactly what these settings all mean, so you've got a good picture of what you have available. So next up we have speed limit. The way they describe that is limit the maximum RPM of the wheelbase. Drift recommends 5 to 10, otherwise recommends 25 to 50. So this is basically the acceleration or the response speed of the steering wheel as it spins in your hand. So if we increase our centering spring here, if we wind that all the way up to 5, we should see the wheel try to spring back to the center. If we crank up that speed limit, we should see the wheel move back to center relatively slowly. And then if we crank that speed limit down, we should see it return to center more quickly. There you go. So that is effectively what that speed limit's doing. So for drifting, you're going to want to have the wheel spin back to center more quickly. For anything else, you're going to be wanting to run higher values here. We're going to set that back to around 50 for now. I'm going to wind that centering spring value back down to 0. Again, we'll explain that in just a minute. So moving on to detail enhancer here, what they have to say is by extracting the features of the force feedback curve, obtain the part with rich detail and enlarge it. The recommended value is between 3 and 5. Now, with the maximum torque, we were talking before about how if you turn that down, it's basically squishing all of the force feedback down within, the scope of the amount of Newton meters that you have available to you. So it's making the smaller forces smaller and the larger forces, relatively smaller as well. So what the detail enhancer does is basically work like a compressor in the audio world. So the way you would make use of that inside the sim is, say you're really happy with how strong the force feedback is overall when you're bumping into walls or other cars, but you're feeling like the road textures are just a little bit too weak. What you can do is you can crank up that detail enhancer, and basically what it's going to do is boost those softer bits to make them feel a little bit stronger. So then we move on to centering spring. This is purely just for games that don't have their own force feedback or their own centering strength. If you want to have some sensation of weight in the wheel or the wheel fighting against you, you can crank in the center spring. And as we saw before, it's going to give you a little bit of force there just through its own software in the absence of other force feedback. Just trying to bring the wheel back into center again. But we're going to leave that on 0 for pretty much most of the sim titles that are around these days. At least some of the arcade games, you may want to wind that in, but for most sims, you're going to leave that on 0. Inherent friction, so this gives you this sensation of weight in the wheel. So if we crank that up, the wheel feels a lot more heavy in its rotation, and back down again, it feels featherweight in your hands. So somewhere around the middle. Again, it's going to depend on the type of car that you're driving and your driving style, how strong you are, but you want to have some sensation of weight in the wheel itself. A lot of sim titles actually have this built into them as well. So again, depending on the sim that you're playing, the type of car you're driving is going to determine where you end up landing with this slider. Now, inherent dampening, let's have a look at what they have to say about that. In the tooltip here, it actually says intrinsic dampening, simulate the deformation of car tires. This recommended value is 10 to 20. So essentially what this is going to be doing is filtering out some of that more mechanical, more robotic sensation that you get in a car. Now, if you've ever driven a car with really low profile tires, you'll notice everything feels a little bit more harsh through the steering. If you've got big, thick, chunky tires, everything feels a little bit more dampened and a little bit more smooth. That is what that is explaining there when it says simulate the deformation of the tire walls. It's like basically just a point of dampening within a real life vehicle, and that's what it's aiming to simulate here as well. But in the real world, you're going to want to fine tune this to get rid of some of the robotic feeling that you might have, again, depending on the car you're driving and the sim title that you're driving in. So inherent inertia works in a similar kind of way to friction. What this does is give you the sensation of, you guessed it, inertia within the steering system of the car itself. So with a real car, with all its mechanical moving parts, as you turn the wheel really quickly, you will start to get a little bit of inertia going on. You will sort of feel a sensation of the wheel trying to continue moving in the direction that you started moving it, and that is what we're simulating here. So if we crank that up, we should feel the wheel sort of try to keep moving a little bit in the direction that it's going. It's hard to sort of see on camera. You don't really see it kind of keeping on trying to go in the direction that it's going, but what I'm feeling through my hands is a sensation of, not only weight behind the car, but also just that sensation of the steering wheel trying to continue to turn in the direction that I'm turning. And it does give it quite a nice, authentic feel. Makes it feel like it's actually physically connected to something rather than just being the steering wheel floating in space. So definitely another important thing to have. So understeer effect, let's have a quick look at what it says for that as well. Calculate the slip angle of the front tires of the car through the telemetry data to change the force feedback strength. The recommended value is 5. So obviously that's pretty self-explanatory there. The more slip angle you have, so the more the front tires are understeering, the more disconnected the force feedback is going to feel, or the lighter it's going to feel to give you that sensation of force feedback through your wheel. And again, it's going to purely depend on the type of car you're driving and the sim that you're driving in. Dynamic dampening, basically the same thing as inherent dampening, but scaled depending on the speed of the vehicle. And then end stop strength, as we saw before, this is the strength of that simulated mechanical bump stop at the end of the range of movement in each direction. So if you want to feel a nice, solid, stiff end stop, you crank it up. If you want to have it relatively weak and be able to easily kind of push past it, then you want to have it on the weaker side. I personally much prefer it to be on the stiffer side, but again, it's a purely subjective personal preference type thing. And then underneath that, we have our adjustments for effects coming out of the game. So if the game that you're playing generates its own effects rather than using telemetry to actually generate those effects through the force feedback engine, then you can adjust those values up and down. So by default at 100%, that's just going to mean that it's going to replicate whatever's coming out of the game. If you wind those up, it's going to boost it. If you wind them down, obviously it's going to reduce them. So that is a quick explanation of all the force feedback adjustments that we have available here. Look, it has the majority of things that I think most people are going to need. I think the tooltips do a pretty good job of explaining what each of these do. They could use a little bit of improvement just in terms of the language used. They're a little bit unclear, a little bit poor English in a few places, but it's better than having nothing for sure. Now, one thing that I think is important to highlight here in comparison to some of the other competitors on the market is that you will need to Alt-Tab out of your game to make adjustments here. The adjustments do take effect immediately, so you don't need to hit commit or save or anything like that. You will feel the effect immediately, but it's not as good as having access to a tuning menu on the wheel where you can make adjustments on the fly, like what we have with FANATEC, for example, or something like we saw with MOZA just recently, where they have a mobile app where you can make these adjustments on the fly without having to exit out of your game. So not a deal breaker by any means, but definitely a point of difference there and a point of disadvantage compared to some of the other competitors on the market today. So that's how the software works in relation to the ET5 and ET3 wheelbases. Let's now take a look at how it works with the FD1 wheel. So we click on the wheel tab here. Now the first thing I want you to understand about these wheels is that they connect to the base, as we saw in the part 1 video, if you've already seen that, via either 2.4 gig wireless technology and inductive coupling for power, or via a USB-C connection. So if we pull it off the base quickly here, you can see there is actually a little USB-C connection down in the bottom there. And when we plug that in, you'll see the wheel will boot up just the same way as it does when you connect it directly to the wheelbase. So there you go, there's the boot up sequence. And now what you can do is, if you want to use one of these wheels with any other brand wheelbase, you can simply get a quick release that will be suitable and plug it in via USB and you're good to go. All you need to do is download this same software and it will operate in exactly the same way, pretty much give or take. There is one difference which I'll show you in just a moment, but you just won't be able to click on the base. You'll only have the option of configuring the things that pertain directly to the wheel. Now you can only upgrade the firmware via the MISC tab when you're connected via USB-C as well. You can see we're already actually running the latest version of firmware on here, but the update process is exactly the same as it was, as I just showed you. So the one difference that I did want to point out quickly is when we're on the system tab here, you can see the analog hat switch operates in all 4 directions when connected via USB-C. When we connect it to the wheelbase, wait for it to boot up again, we only get a left and right on our analog hat switch and no up and down. Now, most people are going to be using that for looking left and right within their sim. I can't imagine many scenarios where you want to look up and down, so I don't really see that being a major issue, but it is one thing that I noticed that was different. We did run through the calibration process, and I'll show you that in just a moment too, but didn't appear to make any difference. You can actually see there the Y-axis is listed as invalid, so I don't know whether that's a limitation of the number of functions that are available via wireless, but either way, at least on the unit that we have here for review, it shows as invalid when connected via the wheelbase. Otherwise, everything else works identically. So let's run you through exactly how all of this stuff works now, starting with our paddles. Now, we have the option here for a couple of different modes. We've got analog axes, as you can see here, left and right, and there's plenty of resolution there on those analog paddles. You can see a nice smooth transition between right and left, 0 and 100%. We also have the option for those to operate as buttons. So just a digital 0 or 1 or 0 or 100 as it shows in the software there. And you'll also notice down on the right-hand side bottom there, it's showing as button 21 and button 22. Say you're driving a car that has DRS and ERS deployment or something like that, and you want to have 2 extra paddles to activate those, you can operate them that way. And then we also have a bite point clutch here as well. So what that allows us to do is adjust the paddles to suit the bite point for the particular car that we're using. So you release one paddle, it gets you to that point where the flywheel is just starting to engage with the driveline, and then you release the second paddle. And that actually goes a little bit crazy there. I'm not sure what the deal is with that, but we'll have a look at that when we do our driving test in just a moment, see whether it's something that is a problem with how that data actually relates back into the sim, or whether it's just the way it's showing in the software here. But that should drop to whatever you set it to there. So adjust our bite point accordingly to the vehicle that we're driving. And then as we release it, there we go. It might have just been a weird calibration thing because it hadn't been calibrated yet, I think. So yeah, that appears to be fine. Yep, there we go. That's operating as expected now. There we go. So what would happen is you would release one paddle, the car would start to get underway, and then you'd release the second paddle to get underway with minimal wheel slide. And you can see there we've got adjustments here or presets for various different bite points for various different cars. But I'd imagine for the majority of people, you're going to want to manually set this. So what you would do is you'd go into the sim, you'd figure out exactly where the friction point is for the car that you're driving, and then you would just adjust this accordingly so that you can always drop one hand, get underway without any wheel slip, and then slowly let out the second stage. And what you can do also is use either hand to activate that. So you can drop the left hand first and then release the right hand, or you can drop the right hand first and then release the left hand. So a good implementation there. I don't see any issues with that. You can also rename your presets as well should you wish to do so. Don't see the option in here for saving those presets though. So that's something that they could definitely add in later on. I'm going to set that back to analog axes for now. And you can see now we're back to having a left hand and a right hand, and you could assign those within the game to be your throttle and brake if you need to. If you can't use pedals, for example, you could set it to be a handbrake and a clutch, for example. Basically, however you want to set it up, you can do so. There's an option here for every type of usage case. Now, if we click on Calibrate 2, you can see we get a countdown menu along the top here, and what it wants us to do is just pull them to the maximum and release them to the minimum a couple of times, just to make sure that everything is functional. And you can see there, I've actually confused it by pulling one of the gear shifters right at the last minute there, so we'll fix that up. There we go. And hopefully when it gets to 0, there we go, it should be calibrated correctly again now. So right, left, and that is all good. So it does appear to get a little bit glitchy sometimes if you don't do exactly what it expects you to do. And I think the instructions could be a little bit clearer on calibration. It doesn't give you any sort of tooltip to tell you whether it wants you to just sort of hold still or whether it wants you to pull to maximum. It does explain it in the manual. It does have a tooltip here that explains the functionality, but it would be good to include a little bit of information on exactly how that calibration works. Now, speaking of calibration, we also have the ability to calibrate our special switches here. So we'll do that quickly now. You'll see the same countdown menu. What it wants us to do is move that analog hat switch in all directions. Again, because we're connected directly to the base, we don't have a Y-axis, and we should see now that is functioning correctly. Now, again, we have an analog axis here. We can set this to be button mode too. So in cases where you want it to operate as a button, you can see here it's operating button 26 to the left and 27 to the right. So if you wanted to use this to maybe flick between different engine maps or something like that, you could do so, increase your brake bias, decrease, and so forth. So analog hat switch on the left, 7-way funky switch on the right-hand side. So we've got our plus rotation for our rotary encoder function, minus to the left, we've got up, we've got down, we've got left, we've got right, and we've got push button, and they all show up on here. Pretty self-explanatory. Down the bottom here, we also have our rotary switches, these two knobs at the bottom. Now we've got 3 different functions here. We've got a multi-position switch mode for both of these, and that will remember the position that it's in. So if we set it to, say, 1, 2, 3 clicks to the left, 1, 2, 3 clicks to the left, take the wheel off, put it back on again, they're going to stay in the same place. Now, interestingly, on the wheel by default, there aren't any stickers on here, so the various different positions don't actually have any meaning. But what you could do is just print off some little stickers of your own to set different positions for various different functions that you use frequently in the sim. Now, not every single sim is compatible with multi-position switches, so what they also do is give you the ability to have a S-pulse mode, or single pulse mode, and what that allows you to do is basically have it operate like a rotary encoder. So 1 move equals 1 pulse in either direction, and you'll actually notice here the switch is flicking for 37 when I move it to the right and 38 when I move it to the left. So you could assign that within your game to increase, again, the fuel map, for example, every time you move it in one direction, the difference being that it's not going to remember the previous state. So if you go back out and go back in again, 1 isn't always going to be engine map 1, for example, so it won't remember where it was previously. And then you also have M-pulse mode here too. So this operates basically the same way as the switch. You'll notice when we're in switch mode here, switch number 50 stays lit up until I move to a different position. So what that's doing is constantly sending a signal for each position on the switch. If I change it to M-pulse, it's basically just a momentary pulse. So you can see it pulses momentarily in each position and then goes back to off state. So again, depending on the sim title, we'll stipulate which mode is going to suit you best here. For me, for now, I'm going to set it to S-pulse, but hopefully that all makes sense. So then we move on to the LED tab. And this actually has a lot of functionality here. I'm really impressed with this. So we've got a series of presets once again across the top for a range of different vehicles from F1 through to trucks. And then we've also got some different presets for different color profiles here too. And again, we can rename these. There's no option to save these externally, but if you do make changes to a profile, change to something else and then change back again, it will store those changes that you've made so you won't lose them. And you probably will find you'll want to set up a couple of different types of vehicles here just to make sure the RPM lights match the reality of the car that you're driving. So underneath here, we have a couple of different things that we can change. There's actually quite a lot of powerful things that we can do here. So RPM LED, we've got a linear. So we should see when we rev our engine up, it goes across the wheel and then flashes when we get to the maximum threshold. We've got a 2-way, so that's going to come from the sides to the center, like so. And then we also have a customize option here as well, which allows us to fine tune. So we've got a range from 10 to 100, and we can simply just adjust each segment to what we want. Now we also have the ability here to adjust whether or not we want the RPM gauge to blink when it reaches the top. So if we click that off, you'll see now it just goes solid. If we click it back on again, it will blink. And we can adjust the blinking point as well. So we can adjust it to be any point above the maximum on our scale. So if we got it set there, for example, we can go down to about there, but not below it, if that makes sense. Now we also have the option here to adjust our overall brightness too on the slider up the top. So we'll go from maximum brightness there. We can wind that down to our minimum brightness about there. So a pretty decent range there. I will probably actually run that at a lower brightness because it is quite in your face otherwise. But if you like to sort of be able to see the color flashing in your face in your peripheral vision without having to look at it, then you definitely have the option to go bright enough there to suit just about anybody. So then down the bottom here, we also have the option to adjust the brightness and the color of each of our buttons on the face here too. So again, a decent range from off to not as bright as we had with the RPM strip, but definitely bright enough, I would say. Definitely wouldn't want it any brighter than that, I don't think, for me at least. So we can switch off each of the individual buttons like so, or we can also set colors for them too. So if we want to change to red, for example, we can double click on red and it will change it. Now the red does look kind of orange, I'll admit. It's not really a deep red, but it is what it is. And let's go through, let's actually change them all like this for now. And there we go. So that is how we adjust our button LEDs. Now on the right-hand side, we also have the option for telemetry-based LEDs for our buttons too, which is something that I haven't actually seen before on buttons, which is cool. So we've got options for pit limiter indication, DRS allowed, DRS active, traction control, ABS, green flag, red flag, yellow flag, blue, white, and black flags. And what you can do is simply just click on the corresponding button face that you want to have light up. And just like we had before, you can choose the color that you want it to change. So for example, if we were to switch on our pit limiter, and because we've got the pit limiter on inside the game in the background right now, that is flashing like so. And now if we switch on yellow flag, we should see, there you go, everything is flashing yellow there. It's a little bit out of sync for some reason, not sure quite what the deal is there. Let's switch it off and on again. Yeah, so they are blinking a little bit out of sync there, not quite sure what the deal is with that, but you get the idea there, and obviously that would work for the various different scenarios, and you can configure it to be whatever buttons you want to have light up for each scenario as well. So pretty cool little feature there, not something that I've seen before on button faces. FANATEC have their flag LEDs as well as the RPM gauge, which can achieve a similar thing. But yeah, it's a pretty cool implementation. So there you have it, guys. That's a quick rundown on the in-platform software, all the functions and features that are available there. And I think, look, overall, it's pretty well laid out. There are a couple of things that I think could use a little bit of tweaking. We did run into a little bit of instability. The app did crash a couple of times on us, so hopefully that's something that they can improve on as well. So really, I think all the fundamentals are pretty much there. It would be great to have a mobile app that you could adjust things like what we have with MOZA, although I don't think the hardware would support it because we don't have a dedicated Bluetooth module to link with your phone. And I don't think that the 2.4G wireless would link to a phone and to the wheel simultaneously. I don't think they're running the same kind of protocol, but don't quote me on that. It may be something that we see down in the future, but maybe they could implement a FANATEC tuning menu style thing, for example, where instead of having a dedicated screen on the wheel itself, because obviously this doesn't have one, they could have an actual overlay pop up over the game and allow you to make adjustments on the wheel with an overlay popping up so you don't have to alt tab out. So plenty of possibilities there, but that is what the software looks like, at least as of the time of making this video. So let's move on now into our impressions of the hardware from a driving perspective. All right, so time to talk about impressions, starting with the physical hardware, first impressions of feeling, things like that, and then we'll go for a drive. So wheel in the hand ergonomically actually feels pretty good, and we covered a lot of this in the part 1 video, so I'll just do a quick recap now. Ergonomically, spacing is good. 320mm design works quite well for GT style. For Formula style cars, you're obviously going to want a smaller diameter than this, most likely. Anywhere between 270, 300mm is pretty good. Would like to see them offer a smaller diameter round wheel as well as a Formula style wheel, but obviously we'll see what they come to the table with in the future. But look, in terms of button layout and everything, don't have to roll my hands around too much to reach the buttons, but we'll look at that once the wheel's on the base. First thing I wanted to talk about is the quick release. Now, this may actually be my favorite quick release that we've seen yet. It does look pretty much much identical to what we've seen before from the likes of MOZA and of course SIMMAGIC, being an NRG style quick release derived from the real world motorsport scene. But what I really love here is what they've done with the inductive coupling system, again, that we looked at in part 1. So rather than having little contacts inside the wheel itself that make contact with pads on the nose of the base, this is all done with inductive coupling, so there's no little pins there that could potentially wear out or get dirt and debris in them later on. Now, obviously there is more complexity to the design overall, so it does potentially lead itself to more failure points. And again, you can have a look at part 1 to see how this design actually works and judge that for yourselves. But in terms of functionality and ease of use, it's really, really good. So to put it on, all we do is just pop the back like so, push it on, and we are good to go. Simple as that. You'll see the wheel boot up, and there we go. There's a startup sequence. We're all connected, everything's working inside the game, and we can see our shifters and everything are immediately functional. So next thing I want to test here is of course flex. Now, the quick release itself, pretty much exactly the same as SIMMAGIC and MOZA. So I can feel a tiny, tiny, tiny little bit of rocking in there, very, very minimal. I really have to pay attention to it to feel it at all. And it's definitely not something that I think I'm going to notice when I'm driving in just a moment, but I'll let you know if I do. But otherwise, very solid. Up and down, there's a little bit of twist in the mount itself, and I'll just have a look at that. There is a tiny little bit of flex between the base itself and the mount, but again, certainly not anything that I think is of a level that's going to concern anybody or probably even be noticeable when driving, to be honest with you. But again, I'll let you know when we are driving. There is a bit of twist in the wheel rim itself, just between the spokes. Pretty much exactly the same as it was with the SIMMAGIC and MOZA wheels that we tested, which look pretty much identical to this in many ways. So that doesn't surprise me at all. But again, all within what I would say are acceptable tolerances. You guys can see for yourself on camera. I am pulling on that, you know, exceptionally hard. I'm pulling on it a lot harder than I would when I'm driving. But again, you can see in the footage when we're driving in just a moment whether it's moving around to a level that you think would impact you, and I'll let you know if I notice anything when driving. But so far, very happy. Shifters are nice and easy to reach as well. They do have adjustment in and out, as we saw again in part 1. And they are a little bit on the loud side, pretty much again the same as what we have from SIMMAGIC and MOZA, being very, very similar, if not identical designs. But yeah, otherwise very happy. Everything's relatively easy to reach. Rotary encoders have a really nice feeling to them as well. So let's jump into the sim now. We're going to do our usual test to begin with here of iRacing with the Porsche 911 Cup car around Imola. Now, if it's your first review that you've seen here of a wheelbase at Boosted Media, the reason why we do this car and track combination, we use it for pedals as well. This car is a rear engine car, so it has quite a strong pendulum effect under braking, no ABS, no traction control, so it moves around a lot. It's quite a handful. And this particular circuit has a lot of off-camber corners, cornering and braking around corners on apexes and lots of weird intricacies. So it's a good combination to test and feel whether we're able to feel all the things we need to maintain correct control of the car. So first thing I always like to do is just get a sense of how the wheelbase actually feels just sitting in the pit lane. Now, I've got to say, my initial impression here is not good at all. It feels quite notchy, and it's actually doing some pretty erratic behavior here. So if I move the car around to the left here, you can see the wheel kind of rocks like that, and it just doesn't, it feels like I'm turning a wheel that's connected to an electric motor and not a wheel inside a car. So definitely not a good first impression there on this profile. Now, we've selected the iRacing profile, and let's see how it actually feels with driving. And again, this is just initial impressions. We're running it at 17 Newton meters of peak force here as well. So it is going to amplify all those little tiny nuances that we're feeling. So first impressions may not be lasting impressions here, but I want to give you guys the sense of what this is like to use straight out of the box, and then we'll do some fine tuning too. So let's head out of the pit lane now, and let's see what we can feel. Let's test out this dual clutch as well. So yeah, that works well. I mean, obviously it's going to be different depending on what car you're driving, but it does what it needs to do. I'm not noticing any excessive lag or anything like that on the input there. You can see down again on the bottom left-hand side there, the telemetry data. We noticed with the MOZA wheel that we reviewed recently that that was glitching quite a lot. Doesn't seem to be an issue here, so that's good. Let's head out. Okay, so I'm not noticing the same level of notchiness The wheel fundamentally does feel smooth. One of the things that we always look for is what they call torque ripple, or the wheel kind of feeling the transition between magnets, between the stator and the rotor. But no, it does feel mechanically smooth. It's just the force feedback effects are feeling very notchy and very robotic. So I'm confident that we're going to be able to dial this in. But the first impression, at least in iRacing, isn't perhaps what I'd hoped it would be. But I think the fundamentals are there. The response time is good. I'm definitely getting a sensation of what the car's doing. I can feel the back of the car moving around on me, but I definitely feel like if this is, and again, obviously we don't know, this is just a generic iRacing profile, so we don't know what car they've actually designed this with. So I think there's probably not a whole lot more value that we're going to get out of an initial impression here simply before we've done some fine tuning. And I don't want to give you guys a negative first impression if we are able to get this dialed in to be better, which I'm confident we can. So let me spend a little bit of time now. Let me fiddle around with the settings. We'll come back, I'll show you exactly where I've landed with it. We will of course test a bunch of different sims as well, and then I'll come back and I'll let you know where we've landed. Okay, so we've spent a significant amount of time here in iRacing fine tuning, as well as spending a bit of time in ACC2, just to sort of get a comparison point between the two of them, sort of try to feel what of what I'm feeling is motor characteristics versus what is generated by the effects and force feedback and all those bits and pieces. So it's good news and bad news here. The good news is that I was able to get it to feel a lot better than the initial impression. The bad news is that it does seem to be a bit of a trade-off kind of scenario with this base. What I've found is the higher force feedback level I set it to. So once I start to push past about 10, 12 Newton meters, it really starts to bring out a lot of the grain, a lot of the details that don't necessarily feel very realistic, so start to feel quite robotic. So what I'm running at the moment is a maximum output level of 17 Newton meters, so we are taking full advantage of the output of the motor as far as the driver software is concerned. And then what I've done inside iRacing is crank down the strength just a little bit, just to ensure that we're not clipping or doing anything like that. And what I've found is that as long as the detail enhancer value is below about 3, then it all feels pretty smooth. And what I'm happy to say is that the graininess that I'm feeling doesn't appear to be torque ripple inherent to the design of the motor. When I have that detail enhancer value set below 3, it is in fact very, very smooth and it feels very authentic. Kind of like what I had hoped the first impression would be like. So I do believe that what I was feeling initially is purely just down to software configuration. So let me head out here now. What I've done is I've left the force feedback gauge on the screen here so you can see for yourselves in real time what's going on as far as the driver software is concerned. And remember, this is the force feedback levels that are being commanded, not what's actually being measured through my inputs. But you'll see there is quite a bit of detail there when I'm going over bumps and so forth. I'm getting the little changes in direction as I'm going down the straights. And over the ripple strips, you can see a nice big spike there up to about 12 Newton meters. Now that 12 Newton meters is significant because, as you can see, I've got the maximum torque set to 17. And what I'm finding is that when I go over that level, that is when I start to get a lot of that grain and a lot of the, I guess, deteriorating overall smoothness and refinedness in the feeling. So it does add extra fidelity cranking that up, but at the sacrifice of feeling quite notchy around center and introducing a lot of other issues. So for me and my personal preference, setting things up so that I'm peaking out at around about 12 Newton meters is what's feeling best for me in terms of getting the most level of detail without adding in additional over-the-top levels of grain and robotic feeling. So it's going to be really interesting in a minute when we switch over to the ET3, which is 10 Newton meters, see whether we get the same effect there, see whether we have problems at 10 Newton meters and then have to wind it down to like 4 or 5 Newton meters to get it to feel good, or whether this is kind of like an extension of that and the problems only arise when we crank things further up. But yeah, look, in terms of the feeling that I'm getting of the car, it feels quite familiar to me, remembering that I'm used to driving with a SIMUCUBE 2 Ultimate, which is a very expensive wheelbase and capable of 35 Newton meters. So way, way, way more powerful than this, but I don't run it anywhere near that. I run it at around about sort of 12 to 15 Newton meters most of the time. But I am able to crank that up to, you know, 30 Newton meters plus if I want to, without it introducing and distorting the force feedback like this is. So I'd say the issues are purely down to just the software and firmware at this point when it comes to the feeling of the wheelbase. I don't think that there's anything inherently wrong with the mechanical design, which is good news because it means that these are all things that at least theoretically can be improved on and fixed over time. And I'm not saying that my settings that you see here on the screen are the be all and end all either. Other people will have completely different settings that they like. But for me, and the things that I like to look for, which is an overall I guess, sensation of realism in the weight of the wheel. You don't want it to be so strong that it's pulling your arms off, but you want it to be strong enough that you get a good sense of the weight and balance of the vehicle. And anything beyond that starts to become detrimental to driving quickly because you're fighting against the car more than you need to. So I'm just going to try and pick up the pace a little bit here. So I guess the one thing that is missing when I crank the details down to the point where I'm not getting the robotic feeling is I'm not getting a good sense of the road texture compared to what I was before. And again, if I crank up that detail enhancer value, remembering that that's almost just like a multiplier on top of the detail that's already there, I feel like what that's doing is it's actually clipping the minor details, but because it's not clipping in terms of the overall maximum output, you're not seeing it on the gauge so much. So, but it kind of feels like that's what's happening. It's like cranking the volume all the way to the maximum on an iPod or something and then turning it down on a secondary amplifier, and you still hear the clipping from the preamp, but you're not getting clipping in your actual speakers, if that makes sense. But it certainly feels like it's a case of trade-offs at the moment, which isn't something that I would say about some of the other wheelbases that we've tested. It does feel good, but I just don't feel like, for me at least, in the things that I look for, which I've described, I don't feel like I'm able to take full advantage of that 17 Newton meters, at least in iRacing, without introducing too many other things which are detrimental to the overall feeling. So we spent a large amount of time testing out the ET5 across a range of different sim titles, including iRacing, as you've already seen, Assetto Corsa Competizione, Assetto Corsa Dirt Rally 2, F1 2021, and Automobilista 2. Happy to say that the experience was pretty consistent across all of those titles. And that's something that we always look for when we're testing out wheelbases, because it's important for people that are jumping between different sim titles all the time, that they're not having to reset their muscle memory completely. So we did find, as usual, that ACC, for example, did a slightly better job of translating things like road textures, curve, and that real kind of granular detail. But the overall impression that we had across all the titles was just that it was a trade-off with this wheelbase between smoothness. You could dial in the smoothness, but then that came at the cost of having a much more dampened overall experience with a lot less fine detail. Whereas if you wanted to crank up that detail, then that came at the cost of some notchiness around the center and significantly more grain. But the thing that really kind of surprised me here was the fact that along with that grain came that sensation of torque ripple, or that kind of notchiness in the general rotation of the wheel around center. Now, it doesn't appear to be a fundamental characteristic of the motor because you can dial out in the settings. So I think that over time we will see improvements to the force feedback. I think that the hardware is fundamentally good, but the software side of things and firmware just needs a little bit more work. So that was our impressions on the ET5. ET3 wheelbase up on the rig now. exactly the same in terms of the mechanical hardware, flex and things like that. Now, software-wise as well, absolutely identical here, so we don't need to go through all the software again, of course. The only thing that's changed here is we now have a maximum torque value of 10 instead of 17 like we had with the ET5. These are the settings that I landed on after about a day of testing with the ET3 for iRacing, and I ended up using pretty much exactly the same settings, give or take a few little minor adjustments just to bring in a little bit more detail depending on the different sim titles. But let's just jump into the car now and I'll talk you through my impressions. So starting off with the initial impressions, just sitting in the car, we have that same issue with just that general lack of overall smoothness in feeling the transition of the weight of the car as we move from side to side. It has a little bit of, I guess, what can only be described as erratic behavior around the center. When you rotate the wheel, and I did fiddle around quite a bit with adjusting the speed limit here to see whether I could dial it out, it feels like it's kind of lagging behind almost as you rotate it. So you get these kind of notches as the motor kind of catches up with where your hands are. Now, I don't know whether that's, I guess, in terms of software, what's actually going on behind the scenes, but that's really just what it feels like. Now, I can dial that notchiness out and make it feel smooth, but then that comes at the cost of trading off in terms of details. So let's drive out now and I'll talk you through what I'm feeling and I guess the adjustments that I've had to make to create the right balance for me, at least, between the various different trade-offs that we have to work with here. Now, again, different people are going to have different feelings here. What I like to feel is going to be different from what other people like to feel, but fundamentally, I think there are some elements which are, important for the overall experience in feeling what you need to feel with the balance of the car, and there are some things that you just don't really need as much. So I think there is a fundamental right and wrong approach to setting up a wheel, but beyond that, it is just pure subjectivity. So when we jump over the sausages there, you can see the force feedback is spiking up to about, well, we can actually see there on the peak value, it's spiking up at the moment. The peak one is, what does that say, 6.5? So we're not quite reaching the maximum 10 Newton meter output here. Now you'll notice the force feedback gauge, as it stands in iRacing, that little letter F there underneath my FPS value, is bouncing up very, very close to clipping, but not quite clipping. You'll notice it turns orange when it gets right to the very top, but we should never actually see it turning red. Now, I had to spend quite a bit of time fine-tuning the game's output here, just to try and bring out as much detail as I possibly could. But what I found is that I wasn't able to reach the full 10 Newton meters output from the motor in terms of what's being commanded, as you see it in the software, without having some clipping in the game. Now, if I cranked it up too far, because you can see my maximum torque output there is already set to 10. If I started to crank up some of the other details, like the detail enhancer, for example, to try and bring out more detail and bring that up to the full 10 Newton meters, then what I found is that it was just becoming way too grainy and robotic feeling. So this is where I kind of landed. And again, this was uniform across all the various different sim titles as well. I wasn't really able to dial this up with more than a peak output of about maybe 8 or 9 Newton meters commanded. And again, this is just what's being read through the software, without it starting to feel very, very grainy and robotic. So what I would say is that even at this strength, it probably is strong enough for the majority of people, but it just comes down to those trade-offs. And I guess the difference here is that with the ET5, we had enough headroom there that we could bring the details up to maybe sort of like 14, 15 Newton meters, which is going to be more than strong enough for the majority of people. I mean, I normally drive with my SIMUCUBE 2 Ultimate at around sort of 12 to 14 Newton meters of strength, just as a point of reference for you guys. So I was able to achieve what I felt was a satisfactory result with the ET5, whereas with the ET3, what I'm finding is that when I'm at a point where I'm comfortable with the level of grain that we have and the level of detail, and not having too much of a robotic feel in the wheel, the only way I'm able to achieve that is at a weaker force feedback level than what I personally feel comfortable with. So you can see there we're still sort of peaking out at around that sort of 6.5 Newton meter mark. What I'm going to do now is just pick up the pace a little bit and just really sort of beat on the car a little bit harder, maybe overdrive the car a little bit, jump over some of the sausages, just so you can kind of see what's going on. So we don't have any clipping going on anywhere, which is good. And the settings where we have them now do provide what I feel is a pretty good compromise, but it is still a compromise. So you can see that when I went over the curb, and I got the car unsettled, but we still only got a spike up to about that same kind of, well, we can see there it's still reading 6.5 Newton meters there. So for me, at least with my personal preferences in wanting to try and keep the wheel feeling as genuine and authentic as it can in terms of, you know, how it feels connected to a steering rack inside a real car, but also trying to bring out as much detail without getting a robotic and grainy feeling. The maximum amount of force feedback that I'm actually able to achieve with this wheelbase is around that sort of 6.57 Newton meter peak. Now we have a couple of options here to increase the overall strength even further. So we can go about it by increasing the gain level inside the game, but what that does is just introduce clipping if we're already at the point where we're right before clipping. And you could see before, when I turn the wheeler, you'll notice again with that little F gauge underneath my 84 frames per second there, when we bump over a couple of curbs here, we'll just come around the chicane down the bottom. That's already very, very, very close to clipping. It's not quite clipping. If I were to hit a wall or something like that where the detail doesn't really matter, it probably would clip, but when we're just kind of bumping over curbs here, over the sausages and so forth, you can see it's very, very close to clipping, but not quite. So if we were to crank that up any further, we'd start to get an even more robotic feeling through the wheel. So we definitely don't want to do that. The other option that we do have here is to turn up the game constant strength. So if we wind that up, what that's essentially doing is just amplifying the signal that's coming out of the sim without amplifying an already clipping signal. So let's go up to 140 just as an example here. So now we're amplifying the force feedback coming out of the game by 40%. And you'll see now my peak force feedback should go a lot higher. So it definitely feels a lot stiffer already, but again at that cost of creating a much more notchy and robotic feeling overall. It just doesn't have that authenticity that it had before. So when we come around and bump over the curbs again, very notchy around the center now. But you can see we are now peaking out at, what does that say, 8.5 I think Newton meters, or 9.5. I can't quite tell. 8.5, okay. So again, we'll run over the sausages in turn one. But you can see already, you can probably notice in the footage, I'm kind of notching around in the center now. So go over these sausages, bam, there we go. Yeah, so we're peaking out at about 8.5 Newton meters now. We could crank that up even further. So let's say go to 160. And that should give us close to our 10 Newton meters peak. But then we're going to have a really grainy feel. So we can see now that's peaking out at 9.32 Newton meters, but all that's really done in terms of the sensation is obviously make it feel stiffer, but also make it a lot more notchy. And you can see now when the car's jerking around, it's very, very robotic. There we go, yeah, so 9.3-ish Newton meters there. So there are a couple other things that we can do here to smooth things off. Again, we can increase our dampening. So say if we wind that up to 40, for example, that does make the wheel feel a lot more smooth around center. But what that's gonna do now is it's gonna numb down those effects, and it's gonna make everything feel very soft and muted. So again, it just becomes a trade-off between different things. You can't have your cake and eat it too with either the ET5 or the ET3. But with the ET5, you've got a little bit more headroom to play with. You can kind of, and again, it does come down to personal preference and how strong you want the bass to be, but yeah, like just when I rolled off the curb there, it was a very robotic kind of jolt through the steering. Around center, it feels really smooth, and the road textures don't actually feel too bad now. But yeah, just those more sudden jerks in the steering when you're kind of, I guess, simulating what the suspension's doing rather than just what you're feeling through the contact patch. That's where it really starts to have that robotic feeling. And just overall numbness. So I think, yeah, if you're happy at operating around that sort of, 6 to 8 Newton meter mark, you probably will be able to dial this in to a point where you'll be happy with it. And again, it's a relative thing. So like if you're coming from, say, like a Logitech or an entry-level belt-driven wheelbase, this is going to feel great to you, and you're not going to have a problem with it. But compared to other bases that are available within this price range, it just doesn't have that detail without other sacrifices. And what I'm finding with the ET3 is to bring it up to the strength levels where I think the majority of people would want to use this, it's coming with too many sacrifices in terms of the quality of the force feedback. And again, this was a pretty uniform thing across all the sims that we tested. Some sims have slightly more road texture or curb detail than others and things like that. So they do have their little strengths and weaknesses there, but the overall experience was very much the same in terms of those trade-offs. So that wraps up our look at the in-platform software as well as the ET5, ET3 and FD1 hardware. So we'll be back again tomorrow with a more detailed discussion on our overall impressions. We'll give Tom a whole bunch of time with the wheel and wheelbases as well, so we can get his impressions as well. And we'll wrap it all up tomorrow with our conclusions as well as comparisons with other hardware available on the market. So make sure that you subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on that tomorrow. And thank you very much for watching, guys. We'll see you again tomorrow. Bye.